In this new chapter of Jinx, we are drawn deeper into the storm brewing within Zhou Zheqiang. The scene opens at his place, and things are far from okay. His frustration is evident, his movements sharp, his jaw clenched, and his eyes clouded with dark thoughts. He throws himself into training, punching the air with relentless force. It's as if he's trying to pummel the frustration out of his system, but the fire in his chest only grows. His mind replays Kim Dan's cold words over and over. This is just work for me. I'm just a tool you go to when you're in the mood. That's how you have always treated me. Zhou Zheqiang stops mid-punch, his breath ragged. The words are a poison that refuses to leave his system. He scoffs bitterly. If someone were standing in front of me right now, they'd be suffering, he thinks. Just recalling that day makes his blood boil. His fists tighten. But no matter what Kim Dan says, I'm still bringing him back. His expression hardens. What Kim Dan thinks or feels doesn't matter anymore. He will get him back. He needs him back. I will be making my comeback soon, he reminds himself. He needs to be in top condition, and that means returning to his strict regimen. If he wants to compete at the same level as before, he needs Kim Dan. There's no other way around it. Kim Dan is his Jinx. That's all there is to it. But despite his resolve, Zhou Zheqiang's mind betrays him. His thoughts drift back to Kim Dan, his bruised lips, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he tried so hard to push him away. He's going to keep avoiding me, Zhou Zheqiang realizes bitterly. He yanks off his gloves, his muscles tense. In that case, the scene shifts. Zhou Zheqiang isn't at his place anymore. He's at the hospice. I'm here for a visit. His voice is smooth, calculated. He isn't here just for a friendly chat. If Kim Dan refuses to come back willingly, then Zhou Zheqiang will find another way. He spots Kim Dan's grandmother, and a sly thought crosses his mind. I'll just have to get to him. Through Granny. But as soon as he sees the old woman's warm smile, a small flicker of guilt tugs at him. It's quickly suppressed. The nurse is pushing the grandmother in her wheelchair, getting ready to take her for a stroll. Zhou Zheqiang steps in. I can take her. The nurse blinks. Are you serious? If it's not too much trouble. The grandmother's face lights up. My goodness, am I really going with Mr. Zhou? Her frail voice is filled with excitement. She doesn't realize she's about to be used as a pawn. The scene shifts again. Zhou Zheqiang and the grandmother stroll through the quiet town, the air crisp and cool. The silence stretches between them until the grandmother speaks. It's a nice little town, isn't it? She muses. This is where I grew up. But you're from Seoul, so you probably don't see the appeal. No, it's nice here, Zhou Zheqiang admits, surprising even himself. The grandmother nods thoughtfully. I heard you came here to recover. How are you feeling? Are you better now? Zhou Zheqiang hesitates. He hadn't expected her to ask about him. The truth is, he's been doing better since he arrived. His mind has been clearer. He's been sleeping well. But he doesn't voice any of this. Almost, he answers instead. And then, in an attempt to shift the conversation, he adds, And you, Granny? You know me, she chuckles. Same as always. But how lucky am I to be strolling with the famous Zhou Zheqiang. The old man next door told me you're a boxer. You must be amazing. Zhou Zheqiang shrugs, feeling strangely bashful. Then the grandmother's tone shifts. But what was it about Dan that made you want to work with him? Is he that good? Zhou Zheqiang freezes. His mind instantly flashes back to those moments. Kim Dan beneath him, flushed and trembling. His pulse quickens. That's way off base, he mutters quickly, shaking off the thought. He's good at his job. The grandmother smiles warmly. I'm glad to hear that. I can't tell you how grateful I am to you. Zhou Zheqiang frowns. Grateful? You kept a roof over his head. You gave him a paycheck. I feel both grateful and regretful, she confesses. Dan has never brought anyone to see me before. You're the first. Zhou Zheqiang blinks. Really? Sure hasn't. The grandmother looks at him meaningfully. That's why I see you almost like another grandson. Zhou Zheqiang stiffens as she gently pats his hand. A grandson? You'll take good care of Dan, won't you? She asks softly. For the first time in a long while, Jo Jaekyung is at a loss for words. The grandmother sighs. My Dan, just the thought of him makes my heart ache. I regret not giving him an easier life. She begins recounting stories from Kim Dan's childhood, how he once called her mom because he had no parents, how he grew up too fast, how he started drinking and smoking. Jo Jaekyung listens in silence, his heart growing heavier with every word. He picked up smoking? He asks, startled. Yes. A heavy smoker, the grandmother nods. I kept nagging him to stop, but he wouldn't. Jo Jaekyung imagines it, but the image doesn't fit. Kim Dan smoking? It feels foreign to him. Does he still smoke? The grandmother asks. Jo Jaekyung shakes his head. I don't think so. That's good. I just want him to take care of himself instead of worrying about me. The grandmother's voice softens. After all, I don't have much time left. Jo Jaekyung finally looks at her. Really looks at her. The weight of her words settles on him. I want you to take Dan back to Seoul with you. Jo Jaekyung sits in complete silence, staring at Kim Dan's grandmother. His usual sharp responses, his natural defiance, they all die in his throat. Dan is only living here for my sake. The words linger in the air like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. I'm sure he has tons of things he wants to accomplish. He should go to Seoul and live his best life. Jo Jaekyung clenches his jaw. Go to Seoul. That had been his plan all along. Drag Kim Dan back to where he belongs. Make him useful. Make him his again. But suddenly, it doesn't feel like a victory anymore. His gaze flickers to the old woman's wrinkled hands, trembling slightly as she grips her blanket. She's worried, genuinely worried. His condition has been a bit off lately. Jo Jaekyung barely breathes. He looks tired, sickly. I think he's having trouble sleeping. His mind flashes back to Kim Dan, his tired face, his pale skin, the weight in his voice when he spoke. Since when? It's been a while. Jo Jaekyung's jaw clenches. Out here in the country, the hospitals aren't the best. He'll need to go to a major one in Seoul. His eyes darken. So it's worse than he thought. I will go when my time comes, the grandmother says softly. But Dan has to live his life. At this rate, he'll kick the bucket first. Jo Jaekyung stiffens, his breath catching. Kick the bucket first? His fists tighten. A cold sensation spreads through his chest. He doesn't respond. The words linger in Jo Jaekyung's mind long after their conversation ends. Later that night, back at his place, he lies in bed, staring at the ceiling. The grandmother's words echo in his head. Is that why he's been so on edge? Just as his thoughts start to spiral, a noise outside catches his attention. A dog barking. Jo Jaekyung gets up, frowning. He steps outside, and what he sees makes his stomach drop. Kim Dan, barefoot, wandering aimlessly into the night. What the? Jo Jaekyung mutters. Kim Dan doesn't respond. His eyes are unfocused, his steps unsteady. Hey, where are you going at this hour? Jo Jaekyung calls out, following him. Still no response. Jo Jaekyung steps closer, reaching out. He grabs Kim Dan's shoulder and pulls him back. Kim Dan stumbles straight into his arms. And that's when Jo Jaekyung realizes. He's asleep. His heart pounds as he holds him, staring down at Kim Dan's peaceful face. He doesn't stir, doesn't fight back. Jo Jaekyung swallows. What the hell is going on with you, Kim Dan? The old man from next door steps outside. Oh dear. Did Dan wander outside again? Jo Jaekyung looks up sharply. Again? Yeah, he does this often. Just walks around in a trance. I think it's all the alcohol he's been drinking. Jo Jaekyung clenches his jaw. His eyes drift to the empty bottles scattered inside Kim Dan's home. How long has this been going on, he asks. Since he got here, the old man sighs. But it's getting worse. One of these days, I'm afraid he might end up drowning himself in the ocean. Jo Jaekyung's grip on Kim Dan tightens. I'll let him sleep in my room tonight, he says, carrying Kim Dan away. And for the first time, a realization settles deep in his chest. Kim Dan isn't just running from him. He's drowning.